When you get to the end of the 4th century, you have, and it's on the screen here, you have the Constantine's empire, all right? And if you look at Constantine's empire, it's vast. It reaches all the way from modern day Spain and France, all the way across to the Holy Land. Right? It includes northern Egypt, northern Africa. And this is all under Emperor Constantine. This is why I say we've kind of gone back into the second golden age of the Roman Empire. Once Constantine became emperor, and certainly once he was the sole emperor and solidified the empire, remember, with the help of the Christian community, he moved the center of the empire from Rome to Constantinople. Now remember, I told you the 3 major metropolitan areas. In the east, you have Antioch, and you have Alexandria. The major metropolitan in the west was Rome. He moved the capital city from Rome, which had always been the center of the Roman Empire, to Constantinople, which is smack dab in the middle of the eastern part of the empire. I keep saying Eastern Empire, but don't misunderstand me. Constantine always saw it, and his descendants always saw it as one Roman Empire. He just moved the capital city, okay? For the next 300 years, so 4 or 5 generations, Constantine's descendants would be emperor. So technically, though it was considered the Roman Empire, this move essentially is what began the Byzantine Empire. Why? Because once the move took place, the Byzantine Empire didn't really have that many dealings with Rome itself any longer. As far as the Roman Empire is concerned, Rome started to lose its influence in the ongoings of the Roman Empire. Once Constantine moved the capital city from Rome to Constantinople, as the years go by, the majority of the population, at least the population with money and wealth, also began to migrate to the east. If the people with money migrates to the east, that means that the majority, not only of the wealth, but the majority of the economy, the majority of I guess this would be the same thing, but commerce, agriculture, everything else is also moving to the east. This left the West much more vulnerable to invasion than the East. Because it also means the majority of the military also moved over to the East. Remember on Friday, when I talked about some of the famous writings of St. Augustine, one of them I mentioned was the City of God. And I mentioned that the City of God was written by Augustine to justify war. Remember, Augustine was in the West. Why did they need something to justify war? Because Rome was starting to get invaded, all right? Much more so than the East. They started dealing every day with threats of being occupied. As a matter of fact, during the City of God, the reason why it was written because Rome was ransacked by the Visigoths from the north. This chaos spread, in fact, next map, give you a little bit more, see what I'm saying. In addition to Rome being ransacked by nomadic tribes from the north, you have, by the time you get into the 6th century, the empire looking a lot different in the west. The empire began to have to continually contend with invading forces from the north. Now, this is not like they automatically was like, hey, we heard Constantine move, let's go in there. These groups had always been fighting in the north, from the north. The problem is, when all the money and wealth and military started going east, it began easier and easier for them to begin to move in. All right. The Roman Empire's territory began to get reduced. It began to get broken up. And no longer in the West did they have a central government. If they no longer have a central government, that means they no longer have civil service. They no longer have a standing army. Instead of having a standing army, you got little groups of armies, but they can't communicate with each other. You have no public court system anymore. And most importantly, you have no method of taxing. All this chaos is happening in the West. But guess what still was standing in the West, even though everything else was falling apart? The church. So that meant the church had to serve as the standing government. The church, or really the bishop, was the only official that could still administer any type of public service. And remember, who would be the greatest bishop in that area? The Patriarch of Rome. Not quite called the Pope yet, but the Patriarch of Rome. This meant that the Patriarch of Rome eventually had to take on public responsibilities. In the beginning, the responsibilities were quite simply, he's trying to negotiate for peace. You got these groups coming in, these occupying territories. He's simply trying to, the best that he can, ensure that transition between these occupying territories and the people went with the least amount of bloodshed as possible. He's trying to negotiate for peace, sparing lives, including his own. The church's influence on politics went more than it had ever went before in the 6th century, when there was a group called the Moravians. Which were from the north. The Moravians came out of what modern day France. So where it says Cologne and Paris, they came from there, and they came into the Roman Empire. And when the Romans in the West were confronted with this group, the Pope found himself, having to negotiate for the people. And so he says to the king, well, he wasn't the king at the time, but the general of the Moravians, trying to negotiate for the peace, he said, look, You're occupying territory. If you want a peaceful transition, what I encourage you to do is become Christian. The first king, his name was Clovis, for the Moravians was pagan. The Pope was pleading with him, look, if you become Christian, the transition will be much better and less bloodshed for the people. The king said, sure, they're pagan, whatever. When you become Christian, I'll become Christian. He converted to Christianity. He had all of his military convert to Christianity. Right? For all intents and purposes, the Franks at that time all converted to Christianity for the sole purpose of negotiating the peace. This resulted in a common ground between the conquered and the conquerors. Yes.
Does that mean that they basically gave up the land, like they let them have the land that they were coming to take? They just, that was the agreement, you guys convert to Christianity, you guys can have this land?
It's not about let, because remember, the empire was completely non-existent in the West. So it's not as much as let as you stop people from the whole revolution piece. We're all Christian. We're going to divide up the lands. Let's work at negotiating this. All right. Yes. I'm gonna get to that. So from the East perspective, this is still the Roman Empire. They're still considered the Roman Empire. It's just that they're getting their butt beat in the West. As far as the East is concerned. All right. This is one of the reasons why you begin to have a split between the East and the West in the church. Who did I say had this negotiation with the Moravian king? The Patriarch of Rome. The Pope, for all intents and purposes. He's negotiating for peace with those who are invading Rome. So what does the East gonna look at this as? They ain't gonna look at it as surrender. They're gonna look at it as treason, right? The Pope is actually negotiating for peace with those who are invading Rome. In addition to the Western Empire having to deal with the Moravian dynasty, you have coming out of North Africa from the south, Islamic forces who are beginning to work their way into the Roman Empire. If the Moravian dynasty is here and the Islamic forces is coming this way, what is inevitable is the Moravian dynasty and the Islamic forces are going to fight. Right? There is one major who served the Moravian dynasty. His name is Martel. Even though he served the Moravian dynasty, his family name was the Carolingians. This general or major fought and engaged the Islamic forces and drove the Islamic forces out, or at least halted. I'm not saying drove them out. He halted their advancement into the Roman Empire. His halting the Islamic forces, how do I say, caused a controversy in the sense that the people then began to say, should his family take over as kings? Guess who got involved in that decision? Patriarch of Rome. The church, on approval of the Patriarch of Rome, took custody of the last Moravian king, put him in a monastery, and then approved the installation of Martel to the throne. Eventually, Martel was called Pepin the Short. Pepin the Short. He's the first in that dynasty. This is the significant thing for us. Well, we've talked about in the past how the church had a close relationship with the state. This is a whole other level. Because now you got the church actually being intimately involved with the installation of a king and the removal of another. And to make things even worse, you had a group coming out of North Europe here, coming into Rome, and had been battling Rome itself and the territories around Rome. Pepin the Short was so grateful for the Patriarch of Rome approving his installation that he took his military and marched them into Rome and drove out what's called the Lombards, who were fighting in around Rome. He drove them out, and guess who he gave Rome to? It was no longer called the at that point, it was no longer called the Patriarch of Rome, it was called the Pope. And this is where you have eventually the establishment of the Papal States. Now, I want to repeat why this is significant in this time. From the perspective of the Emperor of Rome in the East, they're still considering this all the Roman Empire. They're seeing the church in Rome, the Patriarch of Rome, from their perspective, negotiating with those who are invading the Roman Empire. Now we've gone past negotiating for peace. Now you've actually installed a king, or at least approved the installation of a king. And now you have a relationship with him so much that he's given you territory. He's given you lands. If you're from the East, how does that look? You got a conquering group that's coming in, but they're not conquering you. They're going to give you territory and give you land, give you your own sovereign states. That looks like way more than just negotiating for your safety. Now you start to look like you are actually allies with this invading group. This begins the split between the East and the West. We're not there yet, but this begins this idea. I'm talking about the church. I'm not talking about the empire. That there's the church in the West is different than the church in the East because of the Pope's involvement in these. When these things occur, now we're at the end of the first millennium. Now this class, we're supposed to go to the 1500s. We just concluded the first 1,000 years. So let's just take a moment and breathe real quick. What we're saying is at the end of the first 1,000 years of the Christian community went from being small, pacifist communities centered around the teachings of a man named Jesus, whom they felt was God incarnate. They've endured persecution from the Roman government, from the Roman Empire. They experienced material growth, political growth, in social growth with the surge of of Constantine, they did a lot of work, went through councils to establish themselves as one church, only to, by the end of the 1,000 years, right, when we get to the 10th century, 11th century, they're slowly splintering. So much so, that by the time we get to the 11th, 12th century, they're no longer united at all. So it's the age-old question that I think most Christian scholars, historians, theologians ponder, and that is getting in relationship with the state. You have to say being in relationship with the state, particularly with Constantine, helped Christianity explode. But it also, it's almost like the church became so big that it lost its solidarity at the same time and began to split. So it's like a catch-22. Now, before you get to the actual schism of the church, you had some I'll say some signs along the way that the church was in trouble as far as staying together, not theologically, staying together. What are some of these signs? Well, first, because of the division between the East and the West, and because of the invading forces in the West, it made travel difficult from the East into the Western part of the empire. So the East was kind of isolated on its own, but it was isolated with all the money and the wealth. And the West was isolated on its own, fighting invading forces. Because of that, one of the things, Megan, you get that light switch for. One of the things, I think your text talks about this, one of the things that was a sign of problems to come, because of the division, they spoke different languages. Now, you might say, they have always spoken different languages, and that's true. They spoke different languages in their local communities. But as far as the scribes, the theologians, the historians, they all wrote in the same common language. They either wrote in Greek or they wrote in Latin. As the years go by and they're separated, what ends up happening is one group cannot speak to the other. And as the theology grew, they grew up in different languages, meaning they could no longer use the same books. They could no longer use the same points of reference. So that means the theology in the East developed differently than the theology in the West. Which means significant, we'll say significant theologians were different, who they refer to. The theological thought between them are different. And the development of previous theology developed different. And they weren't talking to each other. That's one thing. The second, each side thought differently politically, about political issues. They thought different politically. Remember what I just said. While in the East, in the West, the empire was collapsing, or at least it was starting to splinter because of these nomadic groups and the barbarians that were coming in from the north and the Islamic Islamic forces from the south. While that was happening in the West, the East was prospering. Therefore, the relationship between the church and the state was completely different. I mentioned in the West, in Rome, the church had to, in order for the people to survive, they had to get involved politically, up to the point of approving and placing persons in office. But in the East, where they had an emperor holding everything together, the patriarchs were not involved in political issues. They didn't even think about getting involved in political issues. They didn't have to. So that meant that the political relationship between the church and the state were completely different between the East and the West. And lastly, as a result of these two things, as a result, they each thought differently. Theologically. All that work come together under one creed began to again splinter on certain issues. Some of these issues were a direct result of the political situation that each side found themselves in. Right? Quite frankly, the lack of resources in the West, the need to pay more attention to the ability of the church to maintain itself in the West versus the East. You have a completely different understanding of whether or not priests should marry, whether priests had families. Theologically speaking, there's a difference. A difference began to, quite frankly, some would say this had to do with resources as well. And that is, should the Eucharistic bread be leavened or unleavened? What does liturgy even look like? It's going to be completely different from the East and the West. Because if you have pagan traditions who convert to Christianity, those who convert to Christianity, what are they going to bring with them? You're going to try to assimilate or at least syncretize some of the practice from before in some of the rites and rituals, right? So that means that the liturgy on both sides are going to look completely different. And most importantly, well, I shouldn't say most importantly, but most significantly, how much authority does the church actually have? It's going to be completely different, depending on the East and the West. Specifically under this category of theological differences, there are 3 theological differences that I want you to know specifically. Because these 3 theological differences, well, 2 of the 3, are still what separates the East and the West today, theologically. The first I want to talk about, so these are the theological differences that I want you to know. One is the primacy of the Pope. Primacy of the Pope. In the Western Church at this time, just as today, the church said that the Pope was the Bishop of Rome. But as the Bishop of Rome, the Pope is the head of the whole church. It had authority over all matters within the church. In the East, remember, he wasn't considered the Pope, he was considered the Patriarch of Rome. All right. He was, and this is going to sound, I'll explain it. It's going to sound like an orthodox, what word do I want to use? It's going to sound like an oxymoron, but he was the first among equals. Right? That's how he was considered. So the Patriarch of Rome and the Patriarch of Antioch and the Patriarch of Alexandria and the Patriarch of Constantinople were all considered equal, with the Patriarch of Rome being first, meaning, I'm gonna give you an illustration. You guys know I'm a football guy, right? How many referees are on the field for a football game? Anybody know? 5. One of them has a white hat on, right? He's the referee. But every time they make a call, what do? They kind of get together. I think they be making stuff up sometimes. They make up stuff. That happened to me this weekend. Oh, hold on, y'all about to get me upset. All right, anyway, so, but they get together, they kind of have a talk, right? And then after they have a talk, they run out, and then the dude with the white hat makes the call. But it's after what? A conference. So the East did not think that the Patriarch of Rome was the head of the church and had the ability to govern all matters of the church. What they said was he was the first of the patriarchs, meaning, you know what carried weight in the Eastern church? The councils. When the councils got together and the councils made a creed, or the councils made an announcement, a decree, the Patriarch of Rome may come out and say, this is the decree, but it was after a council. So the weight was on the council, not on the individual pope, right? So that's one of the differences, theological differences that came out of this time. The other is called iconoclasm. Now this is nothing but pure drama. Okay, this is that juicy stuff. That stuff that don't make no sense. Iconoclasm. I'll give you the technical definition of it first. Iconoclasm is the doctrine that artistic portrayals of God or humans used in worship is wrong. That's what iconoclasm is. Now, Emperor Leo II in the East, in the 8th century, in the East still considered the whole thing the Roman Empire, okay? That's important to remember. So he's making a call in the East. He says that all churches need to get rid of icons because he believed in this iconoclasm. This is the emperor. But Pope Gregory out of Rome, Pope Gregory II out of Rome, denounced what the emperor said in the East. He said, no, the emperor's wrong. You ain't got to take that down. The emperor's wrong. This pissed the emperor off, okay? The emperor's like, wait a minute, who you think you are, right? So the emperor, angered by Pope Gregory's announcement, marched into Rome and confiscated all the papal estates. In other words, he was like, oh, you think you somebody? Them people over there, them barbarians over there thinking you somebody, I'm coming to take the papal states. So he comes in and then he takes the papal states. Who do you think the Pope of Rome went and asked help from? He went right back to the people who gave him. They was like, hey, I need y'all help. They tripping. All right, they coming from the East and they tripping. Now, eventually, the East got pushed back out. And quite frankly, side note, theologically, this is the Pope's decree stood, right? But the point is this: the fact that the Pope went to what they saw as the invaders to ask for help, that's strike two. The relationship never got back together, right? So even though I don't want you to think this is a thing, because it's not. Iconoclasm is denounced, obviously. Otherwise, we in big trouble. Okay, right? Both the East and the West. The East uses icons, right? And the West uses icons and statues. That's not the point. The point I want you to make is because of this, it caused even even more split of the relationship between the East and the West. All right? It's almost like they were fighting amongst each other, and then somebody went and got somebody else to get involved in the fight. And that just severed that hurt the relationship. The third theological issue has to do with the term. Let me spell it right. Filioque.
Yeah.
Which means.
And the Son.
Thank you, Andrew. You want to get up and teach? And the Son. I didn't point it out to you, but if you pull out, I'm not asking you to do it because I'm asking you to bring it today. I did not mention this, but if you did pull out the creed that we talked about, this term and the Son was added to the creed in its declaration about the Holy Spirit. Originally, that line said, "We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life who proceeds from the Father." This and the Son was added purely to to fight against Arianism. Because if you put and the Son, then you're equalizing God the Father and God the Son. All right. This form of the creed with and the Son was popular with his name Charlemagne the Great, who eventually he was in the West. He's out of this line, Carolingians, the greatest of the Carolingians. He liked that creed. It's the creed they use there in the West. He sent a message to the Pope in Rome saying, you need to tell the emperor in the East that this is how they need to be saying the creed. You need to tell the emperor in the East and you need to church in the East, this is how they need to say the creed. Now, the emperor in the East thinks he's rightfully the emperor of the West. Yeah, you got this guy who the Pope in Rome said is the emperor, telling us how we need to be saying the creed. How well do you think that went? Nope. And to this day, in the Eastern tradition, if you listen carefully to the creed, they do not say proceeds from the Father and the Son. Whereas we here, the West here, say proceeds from the Father and the Son. So that is a theological difference between the two. The final straw that broke the East and the West was not theological, it was political. As a matter of fact, it was war. It had to do with the Crusades. How many of you are familiar with the Crusades? All right, so I'll tell you, the Crusades was a series of religious wars. It began in the 11th century and went through to the end of the 13th century. These crusades were campaigns directed by the church in the West to go to the Middle East, specifically the Holy Land, to occupy the Holy Land from Islamic rule, because at this time, the Holy Land was occupied by Islamic forces. If you're the Western Church, in order to get to the Holy Land, what do you have to march through? You got to go through the East. All right. In the Fourth Crusade, military men from the West were supposed to be on their way to the Holy Land to fight Muslims for the control of the area. At this time, as they were marching across, Constantinople, or at least the emperor of Constantinople, was removed from office, and he was fighting a nomadic group. Him and his leaders go to this military force from the West that is marching across and says, look, if you make a stop at Constantinople and help me regain my throne, I will give you military men, I will give you resources, I will give you supplies, I will give you money to fund your crusade. They said, sure. All right. On some level, we Christians, on some level, we part of the same empire, sure. When they got there to fight in Constantinople, they got much more resistance than they expected. They did defeat those invading forces, but it cost them a lot of resources. And the emperor who promised them the resources, he died. He didn't make it. So imagine you done fought this war. We done drove them out, but the person who promised you the resources is dead. Do you think the people are gonna give you the resources? You ain't got no proof. I ain't hear him say nothing. And so they said, wait a minute. So we're gonna fight this war for y'all, and y'all not gonna give us resources. Okay, guess what they did? They ransacked Constantinople. The Christians from the so think about what we've talked about, all the work that the Christian communities have done. They actually, well, let's think about it this way. Constantinople, for centuries, had fought off invaders versus the West that had fallen apart. Guess who they failed to? Christians from the West. Now, eventually, the Christians from the West would get driven out because they weren't going there expecting to stay there, right? So they got driven out, but the point is, after that, it was over. It was a wrap. There would never be a relationship between the East and the West ever again. They officially split after that, and they're still separated today. Now, when we talk about the today, when Catholics talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church, because the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, looks at it through the lens of the Roman Catholic Church, we tend to think, the Roman Catholic Church tend to think Eastern Orthodox Church is one church. It's not, okay? The Eastern Orthodox Church is actually a communion of churches, all right? They're identified as the Eastern Orthodox Church because their communities, their social groups are from the East. Traditionally, the East was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Right? But these churches include, so when you hear Roman Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, Romanian, Albanian, et cetera, these are all members of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church often call themselves a communion of the seven councils, or the Church of the Seven Councils. Why? In this class, we've talked about two councils. The reason why they call themselves the Church of the Seven Councils is because the first 7 ecumenical councils, meaning councils that were called in all the church community, all the church leaders came together. 7 of them occurred prior to this split. After this split, they do not recognize as valid any council that happens after that. And in their defense, if they are identifying a schism, any council, if they define a council as a council where everyone in the church, everyone in the body comes together, and guess what? They haven't been in a council, they're not part of it, they don't recognize it as a council. Okay. This is different from the Roman Catholic, well, at that point, became the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church also sees those first 7 ecumenical councils as valid, but they also include 14 other councils that took place after that 7th council. There's one thing I want to mention that I forgot to mention that happened here in the East or the West. I don't know how I forgot to mention it, other than I was just going. I mentioned Charlemagne the Great. It's important for me to mention that, I just said mention 3 times in a row. Charlemagne the Great was the greatest of the Carolingians dynasty. All of these Carolingians were considered kings, right? Which meant if they're kings, the emperor was still the emperor in the East. When Charlemagne went to power, the Pope at the time, and I can't think of the name right now, but the Pope at the time, when Charlemagne the Great became king, he did not install him as king, he installed him as emperor. And then it became the Holy Roman Empire. Which, if you're in the East, if you're the emperor in the East, remember they're already saying you negotiate, you become allies with this person. Now you've made somebody else an emperor. That clearly, to them, is a sign of treason. So now you got the emperor in the East who considers himself rightfully the emperor of the Roman Empire, but you also got an emperor in the West who's saying he's the emperor of the empire. Right? I bring that up because next week when we talk about feudalism, Charlemagne the Great is going to come up again. Any questions on the political state during this time? So we're going to end the class. I want to talk about monastic life. During all of this, the time just after Constantine, all the way up to the time period that we're talking about now. In the background, you have the development of monastic life. First, let me give you the working definition of monasticism. In this course, when I talk about monasticism or the monastic life, I am saying or referring to an institutionalized religious practice or movement whose members live by, quote unquote, a rule of conduct, a way of living. And this rule requires them to do works that go beyond those of ordinary laity and ordinary clergy. That's monasticism. Well, that's how I'm defining monasticism. There are 2 types of monasticism. This is not in the text, so take note. There are 2 types of monasticism. The first kind of monasticism is called Eremitic monasticism. Eremitic monasticism. Eremitic monasticism comes from the Greek word eremos, which means desert. Aromatic, aromatic monasticism is, let's say, 100% solitary. It is characterized by complete withdrawal from society. He certainly wasn't the first, but we're going to be talking about St. Anthony of Egypt. He wasn't the first, but he's credited as being the first Eremitic monk. He left behind civilization in the 3rd century and lived a solitary life in the mountains in Egypt. The reason why he's called the father of the desert fathers is because he was written about by Saint Athanasius. You guys remember Saint Athanasius, right? He was written about by Saint Athanasius in the writing Life of Saint Anthony, which I think I gave you guys an excerpt of that for reading this week, I think. He gradually, this is the thing about, this is the ironic thing about Eremitic monks. Once they withdraw from society, then there's legends kind of start about them, right? Because somebody was out there and saw him, and then he like disappeared, right? Or he saw him and he might have said some words of wisdom. And just like, ooh, right? So then you go back to the town and tell me, I saw this dude in the mountains. Oh, that was Anthony. That's who he was. And this is what he said. So then you start having people ask about him. And guess what they start doing? Go looking for him. You heard it. I'm trying to be by myself. I'm trying to withdraw from society, but people are starting to go looking for him. They start looking for him, or any Eremitic monk. Now they got people that show up all the time, sitting under them and listening to them. Remember I said you have a rule that you live by. He starts sharing what this rule is. So then guess what they do? They start living by that rule. But I have to keep learning about the rule, which means I can't be a hermit too far away because I got to find you to keep learning about the rule. So what happens is you start having these hermit monks live in isolation, but they live close to each other. They live close to each other, and then they say, okay, so every Saturday we're gonna get together and we're gonna listen to whoever the hermit is. So they start getting together on Saturdays. They're like, well, since we're getting together on Saturday, why don't we stay together and celebrate Mass together? Now, since we're celebrating Mass together, why don't we share a meal together? Why don't we pray together? And what happens is, from being 100% solitary Eremitic monks, you go into the second type of monastic life. And that is Cenobitic monasticism. Cenobitic. That is communal life. Today, most monastic life is cenobitic. That means living in community, living all the monks living together under that rule. So now this rule is not just a rule for you, but it's a rule for the community to live a particular daily life in a routine of monastic life. In your text, it lists many founders of different monasteries. And keep in mind, each monastery, each founder of the monastery has a rule, all right, that they're has to follow. I'm just gonna say it. This type of stuff where George Lucas got his idea for the whole Jedi thing, right? I'm not joking. I'm being serious. I'm being serious. The whole idea in the original, now it blew up, but originally, you know, if anyone knows anything about the very first Star Wars movie, where did this guy live? He lived in the desert, hermit by himself, right? And he had this way of living life, right? This mysterious ability, right? As I mentioned, the introduction of monasticism into the West is going to be started when St. Athanasius began to talk about the life of St. Anthony. But really the first monastery started probably in the 4th century by Martin of Tours, who converted to Christianity after serving in the Roman military. He converted and then established a monastery near Milan. Then he moved to Poitiers, where he established a second monastery. He eventually became Bishop of Tours, which is present-day France. And his monastery was kind of like a mixture of eremitic and cenobitic life, meaning most of those who became a monastery lived the life of a hermit, but they lived, this is gonna sound like it don't make sense, a colony of hermits. So they lived a hermetic life, but it gets to the point where you get older and you can't live that life no more. Like, you need somebody to help you, okay? So you have other hermits who helping each other, right? So it's kind of like a quasi. They tried the best to live as hermits, right? But they lived in a colony. Another famous early monastic is John Cassian. He started a monastery in Palestine in Egypt in the 4th century. He too started off with this idea of living as a hermit, but by time towards the end of his life, he actually, his monastery had a total of 5,000 monks and nuns. So he clearly was not 100% solitary. He lived a communal life. The most famous early monk would be Benedict of Nursia. He is the most influential of the Western monks. He wrote his rule called the Rule of Saint Benedict, which I think is another one that I might have put down for you guys to read this week. I'm gonna say his name again. Emperor Charlemagne came across the Rule of Saint Benedict, read it. He wasn't about to be no monk, but he did say this needs to be the rule for all monks in the West. And for all intents and purposes, all the rules written after that, if they did not follow the Rule of Saint Benedict, were heavily influenced by the Rule of Saint. Just to give you an idea of what the daily life of a monk was, a monk's first priority was prayer. So obviously spent a lot of time in prayer. But he also he prepared medicines for the community. They did a lot of scribing, they did a lot of writing. Because remember, most people couldn't read or write. So they both read and write. So they would read out loud so people can read. Imagine instead of reading the newspaper being read to you, all right? Because you can't read. They also did a lot, like I said, scribing and writing. If you go to a museum, you will know that something was written by a monk, because first of all, the handwriting was very neat. But most importantly, anybody look at something and you see the first letter is like a work of art, and then the rest of it is written, that was written by a monk. Okay. Remember how I said you had this rule of St. Benedict? There was a certain way that the monasteries in the West operated. One of the things that was common was they cloistered each other together, right? Even though they lived a communal life, they lived a communal life away from society. That's what was part of being a monk. There was one monastic movement that was completely different from this. And this was the monasteries of the Celtic groups, the Irish, all intents and purposes. They were completely different. When we think of the Irish today, we think of Ireland, we think of Scotland, right? We think of these islands. But in the 4th century, the Irish or the Celts were also part of mainland Europe. Okay? So the initial Celts were converted in the 4th century. But the Celts or the Irish that we think of, they weren't converted until the 5th century. And they really didn't take off until obviously St. Patrick went to Ireland. Which, by the way, how many of you know St. Patrick was not Irish? Most people automatically, they assume St. Patrick was Irish. He was not Irish. He was actually English. Right? He went to Ireland as a missionary. Monastic life took immediately to the Irish in modern day Ireland. And the reason why it grew so fast is because the way they established monasteries was different than the West. Like I said, the West would enclosure themselves together and stay inside. The Irish monks actually did not stay inside, they went out. They went out and they shared not just the gospel, they shared monastic life. This is what we do as monks. And they shared it in such a way that people actually was like, oh, I actually like that, right? And so they started having monasteries after monasteries just blow up in Ireland. One of the things that was unique with the Irish missionary monks was their focus on the culture of the people they encountered. Whatever was important to the local people, they sought to syncretize it with the monastic movement. So, for example, if they came across some Celtic rituals or the pagan rituals that were in those lands, they always made sure that the places that was revered by the people were also revered in their own practices. So, for example, the Celtic people, they really revered nature. It could be a particular stone, it could be a particular tree, a particular area. The Irish monks, instead of bashing these sensitivities, they incorporated them into their message. And they would associate these sacred places with Christian saints. So in other words, they would just replace the pagan deities with Christian saints. However, as a result, there were some differences that developed between Celtic Christianity and the Church of Rome. One of the differences is the Celtic Church focused strongly on Scripture. They did not trust any theology that could not be proven by Scripture, which meant they were suspicious and skeptical of the ecumenical councils, as well as the decrees that came out of the council. In the 6th century, Pope Gregory I sent a delegation from England with 40 monks from Rome to be missionaries where these Celtic monasteries were already at. So in other words, Rome was like, they not quite doing it the way we want it done. So Rome sent their own monks. Reason being, the Pope wanted missionaries and priests who practiced Rome's form of Christianity and not the Irish way of doing things. This came to a head in what was then called Northumbria, which is a land in Ireland, not important, but a synod was called. This is in the 7th century now. And the synod was called to discuss the various differences between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. And the king listened to both arguments. The king recognized the Pope as the voice of the church and thought that the Celtic monks were just arguing how the Celtic Church did it. The king, recognizing the popes and his authority, decreed that Christianity needs to be done the way the Romans do it. And so from that point on, even the Celtic Church gave way to the way the Roman Church did it. I want to end today by speaking specifically, because I don't think it's talked about enough. During these centuries, every time we talk about the monks, we talk about a lot of the male monks who started these orders and started these monasteries, but there were 2 female monks, or nuns, female nuns, that also needs to be highlighted. The first is actually also a patron saint of Ireland, and it has 2 patron saints, not just St. Patrick, but also St. Bridget of Kildare. St. Bridget started a monastery. In fact, she was the first to start what's called a double monastery. A double monastery is this. Remember, you had the men sequestered together, right? Well, at this time, female religious also were sequestered together, but female religious, for the most part, they had the same rule that they had to follow as the males, except one thing. Males were allowed to leave the monastery. Females were not allowed to leave the monastery. So Bridget of Kildare was like, if we can't leave the monastery, can we have a double monastery? Meaning, for the first time, you had a male monastery right next to a female monastery, and literally in the middle, they would come together for the sacraments. So they still were able to worship as a community. But live together separate as men and women. Her significance, though, is that she started this practice of double monasteries, which you see all the time. We'll start with her. The second I want to mention, her name was Leoba. I'm saying Leoba because I don't know if she's a saint or not. She should be. Leoba. This is 8th century. 8th century. Very few men knew how to read. Even fewer women knew how to read. However, Leoba was known for being a theologian of the Old Testament and the New Testament. She knew the writings of the church fathers. She was well versed in the councils, decrees, and even canon law. She was so good that a famous saint, Saint Boniface, asked her to accompany him on a missionary assignment. Again, Emperor Charlemagne noticed her and actually asked her to be part of his court. She also founded monasteries. Both Bridget and Leoba are unique for that time period, but they were not alone. And unfortunately, there are a lot of names of religious sisters at that time period that we will not know their names, but know that there were significant number of religious women at that time who influenced the development of monastic. However, because of the time period, we do not know their names. But they are significant. Yes.
Saint Scholastica is one of my favorites.
There's others that we're going to talk about later on. She wasn't during that time period. She was later.
She was Benedict's sister.
Yeah, but I think she was later than this century though.
Okay.
We haven't got to the latter part of the I think she's later on. I don't think I'm gonna mention her. You're right. Yes.
It's not much for the curriculum.
She is.
According to Wikipedia.
She may be. Like I said, I didn't want to say it because I just didn't know. I didn't know for sure. So, any questions?